Welcome to Larry the Alchemist, where we discuss all things heavy metal and hard rock. And I have a special guest with me here today, no stranger to the layer, Martin Popoff. Martin is a journalist and author. He has a YouTube channel called The Contrarians and a podcast called History in 5 Songs. And we have kind of an interesting episode for you here today. We are going to be discussing the first Led Zeppelin album, the self-titled Led Zeppelin album, often thought of as Led Zeppelin I. And we're throwing out this thought that is the first Led Zeppelin album, is it the most complete, fully formed and developed debut album of the 60s and the 70s? All right, well, what do we mean by that? So many bands from the 60s and 70s, their first 1, 2, or 3 albums don't really sound like the classic version of the band. In the 60s and 70s, it seemed to take almost every band a couple albums till they arrived on their classic sound. You think about the first Scorpions records, Lonesome Crow. You think about early UFO. The first 2 UFO records are more like space rock records. Deep Purple, the Mark I version of Deep Purple, is very, psyche garage rock. But Led Zeppelin arrives with their first album, and it sounds like Led Zeppelin right out of the gate. It is a fully formed, on arrival album. Now, I threw this topic out to Martin. I haven't really talked about it with him, so I'm not sure if Martin agrees with me on this. So, Martin, what do you think? Is Led Zeppelin I, thank you for joining me at the layer here again. And is Led Zeppelin I
no worries,
the most fully formed, right out of the gate, cohesive, complete debut album of the 60s and 70s?
Well, yes, there's my copy of it there. There's your track list. So I would say, and playing this again this morning just to refamiliarize myself with how much this is Zeppelin-esque. I actually figure I'm partially in agreement with you and partially not. I mean, the way I'm most in agreement with you is that Led Zeppelin is known as a band with about 4 to 5 tricks up their sleeve, kind of thing. They have these very distinct directions. There's not a whole pile of variation within each song, but there's major variation between each song. So inter more than intra, right, with Led Zeppelin, and I think this is the most interesting thing about. So that's a sophisticated thing that they do, and that sophisticated thing that they do is on that debut album. So just quickly going through the tracks. So you've got Good Times. Well, I'll clump them. Good Times, Bad Times, and Communication Breakdown. To me, represents their invention of a nascent heavy metal sort of situation. This is early 1969, so it's a little late. It's a little bit of late. It's a little bit of early, right? We consider Friday the 13th, February 1970, Black Sabbath kind of invents heavy metal. But Led Zeppelin is there with 2 records in the 60s. So I think you get a little bit of that invention with Good Times, Bad Times, and Communication Breakdown. You get their big British folk boom sound on here as well with Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You and Black Mountainside. You get straight blues on here, so straight British blues boom, like just no bones about it, no real massive variation in You Shook Me and I Can't Quit You, Baby. And then you get that sweet spot between what is the heaviest blues you can possibly imagine that is still blues and is not heavy metal, with How Many More Times and Dazed and Confused. And you definitely get a lot of so the way that it's not fully formed enough for me in a certain respect is, out of 9 tracks, you get 2 absolute straight wrote blues on here, and then you do get the straight folk stuff, and it's even instrumental, and I will add this. I think the invention of heavy metal on this album is quite weak. It's not Whole Lot of Love, which to me is much closer to the invention of heavy metal with that disciplined palm muted sound. It's not Immigrant Song. It's not Out on the Tiles. It's not, you know, 3/5 of Physical Graffiti. And I really discount Zeppelin on the invention of metal thing. I don't consider them super important in that respect, but they are there, and they are talked about because there is some heaviness. Live and Love and Made, Heartbreaker, Moby Dick, not so much Moby Dick, but there's a fair bit of stuff on Zeppelin too as well. So they're weak in that department, and they're weak in the idea of having two absolutely rote blues. But I agree with you that they are very crudely ticking the boxes of a sophisticated melange of sounds Led Zeppelin will be known for. Certainly through the first four albums, I would say. I'll turn it back over to you at that point.
All right, I agree with a lot of your points. I would say though that you mentioned like the blues thing, for instance, the stock that's sort of straight up British blues. I would say that that's something that they still carried with them. I mean, since I've been loving you, you know, that comes out later in their catalog, and that's pretty much a straight up, you know, blues feel to it. The folk stuff, especially, I would say that they carry through. Look at Led Zeppelin III, that's filled with a lot of like folky type of elements. Even on Physical Graffiti, you get some acoustic guitars and folky elements. So I think that these three elements that you mentioned, that these are the characteristics of Led Zeppelin, something that they would have to varying degrees on almost all their albums from this point out. And they're sort of here on this record, even when they do the blues. I mean, I might give you the only song for me that seems, You Shook Me, for instance, is very dirgy, and it's sort of like kind of a holdover from the Yardbirds era of the band. But for me, this is Led Zeppelin. And even though they progressed and they changed album to album, as a lot of bands did from the 70s, when you line it up against, man, almost anybody from this era, so many bands were so far away from what their sound was. Think about the first two Thin Lizzy albums. Think about I mentioned UFO already. I mentioned Deep Purple.
This one as well.
Yeah, the Yes records. I mean, it was almost like a given that during this era, when a record label signed a band, they almost wrote off the first one or two albums as like, well, this is you finding your sound. And so it usually took a band three albums. Motorhead, the first Motorhead record doesn't sound like Motorhead. The first Judas Priest album doesn't particularly sound like Judas Priest. You can hear these bands searching, and maybe we'll talk about the first Black Sabbath album, because I think a lot of people are going to say, what about the first Black Sabbath album? We'll get to that. So many bands, when you listen to their first record, you might hear elements of what they would become, but you really hear them searching and wandering around, and there's always some weird song on it, you know, that just totally doesn't fit with what the band would become later on. And I would also add that there's some interesting elements about Led Zeppelin. They weren't a bunch of nobodies. Jimmy Page, an established session musician, as was John Paul Jones. You might say Bonham and Plant are the most unknown characters in the band, but they weren't a band that slugged it out in the club scene, that did their 3-week residency in Germany and stuff like that, you know, slugging it out in the club scene for 2 or 3 years before they released their first record. They pretty much get together, they release this album, they're a hit right out of the box. The production on this album, that's another element you could look to. The production on Led Zeppelin I isn't really, if somebody told me they felt Led Zeppelin I was their favorite sounding Zeppelin record, I could understand that. I could even agree with that. It doesn't sound weird in their catalog sonically. It pretty much arrives sounding really put together. Again, go through all these other bands. Usually their first or second album is sonically a mess. It's very low budget or kind of all over the place. It takes the band a couple records to land on their sound. So for me, that's why I hear you about the blues elements and the folk elements, but I think that they carry that through all their albums to such a degree that it doesn't make this album stand out. It seem like an outlier or anything. If anything, I would say that Led Zeppelin III sounds like it could have been the first Led Zeppelin record. If that was the first Led Zeppelin record, we all would have said, "Oh yeah, there was like a lot of acoustic guitars and things on that first record." And it wasn't until they moved on from that where they got a little bit heavier and dialed down the acoustic element. To me, Led Zeppelin III is sort of like the weird sort of outlier in those early Zeppelin records.
I think we can clump these things into two categories. Like I figure Led Zeppelin I is almost like the demo version of Led Zeppelin II. I think Rock and Roll is like the demo version of Sad Wings of Destiny. I think Aerosmith I is the demo version of Get Your Wings. I think Motorhead I is the demo version of Overkill. So you've got bands that are essentially doing all their elements, but doing them more crudely. And then you've got the likes of I Held Up This Yes album, where they're still kind of, it's a different sound. It's more of a psyche sound. All the prog bands fit into this. Pink Floyd started as basically the flagship UK psych band, and then moved away from that. Genesis started as like a Canterbury pop prog band, and then moved away from that on the second album. Jethro Tull started as a blues boom band and then moved away from that on the second album. So I think there are, and UFO certainly, the UFO with Mick Bolton, there's, that door shuts and then they become the UFO with Michael Schenker. That's a big difference there as well. So I think there's a lot of those like that. So Fully Formed, I believe in the Fully Formed, in that they are touching down on all of these directions, and it is a complicated direction. So it's more of a great argument here than it is with Motorhead, for example, because basically Motorhead has kind of one speed sort of thing. The one song I forgot to mention on here, a curious one, is Your Time Is Gonna Come, which to me feels, on one hand, I want to say that it's not part of what they're going to do in the future, because to me it sounds a little bit like a West Coast psych song. But when I play it in my head, I can hear them being a little down home country rock here and there throughout the catalog as we move forward as well. Hey Hey My, or whatever that song's called. Hey Hey, what you gonna do? The B-side thing, Black Country Woman, I suppose, a little bit. I love what you said about Led Zeppelin III, because you can definitely hear like this is a well-produced album for early '69, but I think this Led Zeppelin II is better produced. There's your Zepp 2. And three is a funny one, that you could imagine that as being the early '69 recording, for sure. And you could imagine all of that second side being songs that are no great shakes of an advancement in terms of songwriting that couldn't have existed in early 1969. It's hard to imagine Out on the Tiles coming out in early 1969. I can imagine Friends being there. And Immigrant Song's a little up for grabs. It's so rudimentary, but it's also, I could almost imagine it being there as an interesting creative outlier, like a Purple Haze or a Helter Skelter sort of thing, right? Or an MC5 Kick Out the Jams. Just a couple of those songs that seem a little more ahead of their time in terms of inventing heavy metal. So yeah, you're right. I could see Zepp 3 being there, and it is considered a little bit of an outlier. But I love the way Zepp 3 does feel like it literally could have been their earliest recording in terms of the production values.
Yeah. All right. So what might be some contenders then that might be more fully formed or as fully formed as we're talking about here as Led Zeppelin I. Now, just as a note, I meant to mention this at the beginning. These other first albums, this doesn't mean we don't like these albums. You know, I like the first Judas Priest record. I like Lonesome Crow from the Scorpions. Uh, it's just that the
I
argument
don't
here
like
to
most of these first albums. I mean,
right. Well, they have some
80,
sort of
80% of them I would say I don't like. So
they have some sort of weird like uh weird sort of charm to them, being that they're so different, which makes the point of what we're discussing here, that they don't really sound like the rest of the band. The first Saxon record, there's just so many albums
definitely.
that you can go down the list. All right, but what are some contenders for albums that to compete with Led Zeppelin one here for being the most, together, most sounding like the classic band? I know a lot of people are going to say the first Black Sabbath album. So tell me why you think it is or isn't as complete as the first Led Zeppelin.
I would say it's not as complete by a little bit, but it does definitely fit in my definition of being the demo version of what comes next. And they're doing a pretty good job of covering all the bases. There's totally the invention of heavy metal in there with Wizard and NIB and Black Sabbath. It is just a little more unwound and jammy and bluesy and hippie-ish than what would happen here. I think they lock it down here, and the riffs come hard and heavy and fast and furious and hit you right between the eyes with all of these sorts of songs, right? So yeah, I almost put it in this. I put it in the same camp, but I adhere more to your argument that Zepp 1 is closer to Zepp 2 than Sabbath 1 is to Sabbath 2. I think the one that blows this argument out of the water kind of thing and is much closer is Uriah Heep. Very heavy, very humble, or Uriah Heep as it's known in the States. That's one where Salisbury could have been their first one, right? Salisbury is the outlier, and it's like, who is this weird hippie proggy krautrock morose band, whereas the riffs and the quality of the production, and you think of Gypsy and Bird of Prey, which we got on our American one, and then the difference between the first Heap and Look at Yourself is not that great. And Look at Yourself is just a better album, and it's just so dynamic and so good. And there are some things on the first Heap that sound just a little bit wobbly, Walking in Your Shadows, or what's the other one called? And anyways, it's got a few. Dream Mare is there as well, and the a couple of the ballads, the cover ballad Walk Away Melinda, or whatever it's called. Yeah, he definitely feels like a pretty modern, well put together album. I always put Heap up as a very similar album to Paranoid and to Deep Purple in rock, and yet it's the first. So I think they arrived. Had they arrived with that before Sabbath arrived with the first one, or had they arrived with that and Deep Purple was still fiddling about with their depressing, psych Vanilla Fudge sound, Heap would have been the ones who would have invented metal. And the other one that's almost not fair, because it is a little later, and then they unformed themselves, is Montrose. The Montrose album in 73, it's not that much later, but talk about arriving fully formed. That's arriving fully formed the way Van Halen arrives fully formed, right?
Yeah, the Van Halen record, that would be a good example. I didn't think about Van Halen. That first Van Halen record, yeah, that one.
But the funny thing about that one that I've always said is that that's the most professional record they ever made. It's the most conservative record they ever made, the best produced, the best performed. And then Van Halen discovered their sound, which was actually more amateurish on 2 and all the records moving forward. So it's almost like the first one. So there's a little more parallel with Montrose. Not really, but Montrose just kind of got worse. But Van Halen basically discovered their sound on 2. But their most professional sound, where they were the most behaved and the most sober, was on the first one. It's so locked down. Everything is absolutely perfect and in its place. And then they became the Who on the second album, and they remained the Who throughout their entire career, kind of thing. So
Yeah.
that's a funny one. But yeah, that Montrose. So what happens with Montrose is that they basically kind of blow it. They kind of blow up the band. Ronnie doesn't want to do that amazing record for a second time. So the second one is kind of all over the place. It's not nearly as heavy and it's not as cool. So yeah, that's a big one. But if we're sticking with these early ones, the big four of the creation of heavy metal kind of thing, I think Uriah Heep is an even better example than Zepp one.
Yeah, I would agree with you about Uriah Heep, especially if you're talking about the US version, which swaps out Lucy Blues for, like what you mentioned, Bird of Prey. Lucy Blues really drags that and dates that's the most dated, maybe next to Walk Away Melinda. Uh Agree. The thing about Montrose for me is that they didn't really have enough albums after that. For, like you said, they sort of had, I mean, it's a great debut album, but they didn't really sound like that, because after that they just sort of, like you said, it just sort of fell apart on them, and they didn't put out that many records. But I would like to throw in the ring here, how about the first Jimi Hendrix album, Are You Experienced? That lands pretty, and considering that, Are You Experienced, I think, is 67, I think. So many of the bands, especially when we get past like 68, earlier than 68, 69. Think about the Beatles, think about the Stones. They were completely different bands when they first started. They were like cover bands, basically doing covers of Motown and blues tunes. So for Jimi Hendrix to show up, that first Jimi Hendrix record is pretty fully formed, sounds really like Jimi Hendrix, doesn't sounds like classic Jimi Hendrix. Again, it isn't so weird that it's like by the time you get to Electric Ladyland, you would still know it's Jimi Hendrix. A litmus test for some of these albums would be to say, well, if you were to play the first Uriah Heep for somebody who's only heard the other Uriah Heep records, would they know it's Uriah Heep? If you played the first UFO album, people probably wouldn't even know it's UFO or Genesis or a lot of these bands that we're mentioning. They're so strange. But I would throw also Jimi Hendrix in that ring. I might throw Cream in there, but the problem with Cream is sort of they didn't put out that many records, and by the time you get to Disraeli Gears, it's like half live and half, and the way they're doing like blues covers and stuff like that. So I don't think I would throw Cream in there, although I guess somebody could make that argument. But I'd also throw in there Jimi Hendrix. Are You
I'll add one
Experienced?
more too. The Stooges. Stooges only made 3 albums. They're all quite different from each other, but I think the first one, it's a relative comparison I'm making here. But that comparison I made of Van Halen being the most professional and sober on their debut, I think you get that with the Stooges too. I think that first one is the best recorded out of all 3 of them, unfortunately. So you've got a 69 album, a 70 album, and a 73 album, right? And the 73 album, they've gone through some changes. They've almost broke up or reformed or whatever. They're barely functioning. They're on a different label. They're recording it in England. But still, the second album is notoriously dirty sounding. So is the third album. But the first album, they're behaved. They're basically going through these songs relatively sober. I imagine the recording's pretty good. There's a lot of songs. They got riffs. So I think whatever fully formed is, I mean, I think basically the music across those 3 albums is generally in the same ballpark, but I think the most professional they ever were was on the first one.
Yeah. Yeah. I might discount the Van Halen record just because, I mean, it is still in the 70s. That's sort of the criteria that I said here in the intro, the 60s, the 70s. But by the time we get to like 1980, for instance, you start having bands showing up. Their first record is there. Iron Maiden, for instance. But when we're in the late 70s, I guess it's not fair. I mean, look at Accept. Accept doesn't sound like Accept. Crocus doesn't sound like Crocus. on their early stuff, but Van Halen shows up and yeah, they do sound pretty together. So, all right, well, let's look at. I was jotting down some notes here,
Mhm.
and let's see if you tell me your pick out of what we discussed, or if something else comes to you. So we mentioned the first Van Halen, we mentioned the first Montrose, Uriah Heep, the first Hendrix, and the first Stooges record, and of course, in play here is the first Led Zeppelin record. So, out of those, or if another one pops in your head, what would be your vote for this award?
For most fully formed,
Yeah, for the most,
um,
sounds like the classic era of the band, the most developed, the most, there on the first record.
it's funny. I want to say Heap, but really it's Gypsy and Bird of Prey, and Gypsy even over Bird of Prey, given how absolutely gorgeous they've got that Hammond organ heavy metal alloy and David Byron in there. Like I could just picture that song sitting on any of the David Byron era albums, no problem, right? It's just so beautifully put together. And I've always argued that Heap, especially on Look at Yourself, got that Deep Purple sound better than Deep Purple ever got it down, even on Machine Head, right? I think Look at Yourself is a superior album to Machine Head. So it's funny. Boy, I don't know. It's and Zeppelin is good too, but I almost feel like there's none of them. I would vote for none of them as being perfectly fully formed.
Yeah.
Um, and really the fully formed thing, like I say, is almost just in relation to itself, I suppose, as the band moving forward. And that's why that weird Stooges discussion comes in, right? I mean, it's almost like if you can think super abstractly about this, I'd almost pick the Stooges out of all of them. We didn't talk about MC5, and MC5's another funny one where you almost couldn't say that. They kind of make I would say it's their heaviest album as the first one, Kick Out the Jams, but it cheats by being a live album, number one. And then they make this sort of weird semi-retro album with a very thin sound for back in the USA. And then they make a pretty heavy album, but it's a little all over the place for High Time, right? And they only make 3 albums. So I don't know. I Mountain and Cactus, and we talk about those bands. I'm just never super impressed, anyways, with what they're doing. This whole, I always talk about this idea how the British blues boom thing just lagged on and had a hangover through much of the early 70s.
Yeah.
While over in the UK they were busy making exciting new heavy metal albums, regularly. And then I always say, like, America's first heavy metal album is Montrose, and that's 1973, right? And just there's
Yeah.
nothing else that really qualifies, right? So
And what complicates this is that in the 70s, the 60s, late 60s through the 70s, bands, it was almost an expectation, a given that you were going to evolve and change through your catalog. You look at so many of the bands from the 70s, Jethro Tull, Genesis, Zeppelin, so many of these bands, that Pink Floyd, album to album, you changed, you expanded, you experimented, you did different things. Whereas by the time we get to like 79, 80, that sort of goes away and bands start becoming, okay, you got your sound and you do your sound. You do some little variations here and there, but for the most part, you stick with what you do. You don't get the wild experimentation that you get from bands like Yes and Pink Floyd and gosh, even Judas Priest, album to album. They really changed a lot more in the 70s. Than by the time they get to 1980, they sort of find a sound and they ride it, they ride it through the 80s for the most part. So that
yeah,
sort of complicates this also,
yeah.
because it was just the nature of the beast in the 60s and 70s for bands to change and evolve and experiment and do different things. That was encouraged during that era.
Yeah, I think what happens is you've got, by the time 1980, say, to pick a round number, rolls around, you've got, rock history itself, and the discography of rock is approximately 50 times bigger than it was, maybe 100 times bigger than it was in 1970. You've got at least 4 or 5 well, actually, bring in the English newspapers and stuff, the entertainment newspapers. You've got probably a dozen huge rock magazines that have been teaching people about the history of rock throughout all the 70s, right? So by 1980, you're supposed to be just a scholar of rock by the time you arrive with your first album. There's lots and lots of lessons that have been learned, and you're expected to know them, sort of thing. So that's why, yeah, they're no longer stumbling around in the dark. And you think of some of the stumbling around that happened. I mean, everybody has different stories, but you've got that strange Mick Bolton UFO era where they're just a hangover of this British blues boom sound, and they're kind of influenced by Free as well, and that sort of feel. And they're just like teenagers. They're on a small label. You've got Scorpions. They're operating in Germany, which is basically still super the backwoods at this point. So they don't know what they're doing either. There's a krautrock history, I suppose, a little bit. So there's a little bit of like operating in the dark when you're back then. But yeah, you're no longer operating in the dark by the time you get to 1980.
Yeah, and it's a good point that in the late 60s and 70s, they were basically inventing this heavy rock slash heavy metal sound. So it was sort of like people stabbing around in the dark sometimes, or trying out different things, seeing what's going to work and this and that. And by the time you get to the late 70s, you have this blueprint to follow. We mentioned Van Halen. Well, Montrose, that first, whenever I think of Montrose, I think of Van Halen, because there's such that sound. You can tell that was an influence on them. So yeah, it's even AC/DC, the first AC/DC record doesn't really, I mean, it sounds like AC/DC, but it's sort of an outlier. It's sort of this funny little outlier within their catalog. And a lot of that was probably, like you said, the way information got passed around back then. And it was everybody was discovering themselves back then, and experimenting and trying to figure out this thing that we call heavy rock and heavy metal. So
yeah. And you bring up AC/DC, so they're operating somewhat in a backwater as well at that time. But a absolutely huge illustrative example of that is Crocus. Like Crocus is a weird mess when they first start out, being there in Switzerland, of course. And then you think of the Japanese bands of the 70s, how it's very super insular, but by the time you get to Bow Wow and Loudness and stuff, you could tell they've heard a lot of Western music, kind of thing, right?
yeah.
So yeah, you get AC/DC is a great example of a total outlier. You just hear like about half that album sounds like wobbly versions of your TNT Dirty Deeds sort of sound, and then they come fully formed, and then they slowly evolve over time. But and the Angels is kind of the same thing. They've got a first album that's a little swampy or dated sounding. Kind of things. So, yes, Sabbath's a funny one as well. Like I say, and I've always said, in this demo version idea, I've always put Rock-a-Rolla a little closer to Sad Wings than most people. To me, it sounds like they're like this Zeppelin argument that you have. Like they seem to be hitting most of the same marks on that record that they're going to hit on Sad Wings. You think of Cheater and Never Satisfied. Rock-a-Rolla, even though it's a heavy song, is a little bit of an outlier. That doesn't feel like a Sad Wings song, but Never Satisfied and Cheater feel like Sad Wings songs, but just a little rounded off. They haven't sorted it out yet, a little cruder, right? And that's what I feel is this Zeppelin situation. It just, Zeppelin 2 feels like Zeppelin 1 on steroids, sort of thing.
Yeah. And the first Black Sabbath album, especially if you're thinking of the European version of that had Evil Woman in place of Wicked World, that really, you got two cover songs on their version of the first record. So that even pushes it even more outside of the typical Sabbath sound. So
yeah.
Okay. So I don't know if we answered the question.
John, where do you put Ted Nugent? Give me your Ted Nugent.
Oh, gosh. That's a good one. I want to say it's almost a little unfair with the Nuge, because he comes out of the Amboy Dukes.
Yeah.
And do we consider the Amboy Dukes Ted Nugent? You know what I mean? Or are we talking the first Ted Nugent Ted Nugent album, because you're right, that first Ted Nugent album is very there, but it's almost a little unfair because he because of the Amboy Dukes. And don't they even call it Ted Nugent in the Amboy Dukes by the time we get to like the last Amboy Dukes record?
Yeah, I would say with Ted Nugent, you got a massive demarcation between your Marriage on the Rocks, Survival of the Fittest, Amboy Dukes, and your Call of the Wild and Tooth, Fang, and Claw, Amboy Dukes. So I think Call of the Wild and Tooth, Fang, and Claw are the demo versions of the Ted Nugent album, right?
Yeah,
The two discrete records albums.
yeah. All right. Well, it's tricky. It's a hard thing to really sort of nail down. So let us know out there what you guys think. Do you think I might have to change the title of this of this video? I was going to just have Led Zeppelin in the title, but I think there's a lot of really good contenders for this category. You mentioned Van Halen, mentioned Montrose, Uriah Heep, Ted Nugent. So let us know what you guys think out there. What is the most fully formed, arriving, sounding like the classic era of the band debut album from the 60s and the 70s? Let us know what you guys think in the comments down below. Martin, what do you got going on in your world? I know you always got some new stuff on the horizon. So what's happening?
Well, I guess our regular our show, The Contrarians, we're regularly putting up videos. I have the audio podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff, which I haven't missed a week. I'm up to episode 215. What is this episode about? Oh yeah, this episode's all about instrumentals. That's going up shortly, and we just did song title non-starter song title, something like that. But yeah, got that. And then all the books are at martinpopoff.com. There was the Cure book recently. We've got the Blue Oyster Cult, which you contributed to. That's coming down the pipe soon. That's a panel book, an expert panel just going through every studio album. So that's coming out shortly. My Who book is coming out shortly. Who Quadrophenia, 50-year anniversary book. And yeah, martinpopoff.com for all that stuff.
And I'll link all that in the description down below. Any final thoughts on this topic, Martin, before we wrap it up?
Boy,
or have we said it all?
Yeah, it almost got more complicated over
we
time,
opened up a Pandora's box here as we went along. So what about this album? And it sort of opened up all these other things. So it is sort of an unanswered question. I'm going to agree
with you on your Zeppelin choice. I think because put it this way, I like the Zeppelin choice because they're coming fully formed with probably the most complicated sound out of all these bands.
I like that. Yeah, that's a good way to summarize it. So, okay. Thanks again to Martin. Links in the description down below. And everybody, let us know what you guys think. Let us know in the comments down below. Till we see you again. Make sure you stay heavy, stay metal.